had always thought of her life as a series of carefully stitched patterns, repetitive, predictable, and comforting in their familiarity. At 53, her days were a carousel of quiet routines. Mornings spent tending to her small garden, afternoons volunteering at the local library, and evenings shared only with the soft hum of the radio and the company of her cat Lucy. It wasn't an unhappy life, but it was undeniably solitary, a life shaped more by habit than by hope. The grocery store was part of that routine, a necessary stop every Wednesday morning. She liked to arrive early, avoiding the busy chatter of the midday crowd. The aisles, lined with their rows of neatly stacked goods, felt like an extension of her ordered world. But on one particular Wednesday, something disrupted the symmetry. As Anna reached for a carton of milk, a voice broke through her concentration. "Excuse me, ma'am, do you know if this brand is any good?" She turned to find a young man standing beside her, holding up a different carton with a sheepish grin. His presence startled her, not because he was particularly striking, though he was, with his dark hair and a 5 o'clock shadow that softened his features, but because it had been years since anyone had sought her advice for something so trivial. "I suppose it depends on what you're looking for," Anna replied, her voice polite but tentative. "Something better than the water masquerading as milk I've been drinking," he said with a laugh that made his brown eyes crinkle at the edges. Against her better judgment, Anna found herself smiling. "Then I'd recommend the organic brand. It's pricier, but it tastes closer to what milk used to be." "Noted," he said, placing the carton into his basket. "Thanks for the tip." As he walked away, Anna felt a strange warmth lingering in her chest. It wasn't much, a fleeting interaction, no more significant than the dozens she'd had over the years, but there was something about it that stayed with her. Perhaps it was his easy charm, or the way he looked her in the eye like she was someone worth listening to. The following week, she saw him again, this time in the produce section. He greeted her with the same bright smile and an enthusiastic wave. "Well, if it isn't my milk expert." Anna chuckled, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. She had forgotten how unfamiliar the sensation of attention could feel. From that point on, their encounters became a regular part of her grocery trips. His name was Mark, she learned, and he was 28, a detail that surprised her but didn't dampen their easy rapport. He was new in town, a graphic designer working remotely, and often joked that he relied on her for culinary wisdom. As the weeks passed, those moments in the store became the highlight of Anna's week. Mark's laughter, his casual stories about his life, and the way he seemed genuinely interested in her advice added a spark to her otherwise steady days. She told herself it was nothing, a pleasant distraction, a fleeting friendship, but deep down, she felt something beginning to stir. She didn't know it yet, but that brief, ordinary meeting in the dairy aisle had set something extraordinary in motion. Something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, her heart, and the uncharted possibilities of love. Anna hadn't realized how much she'd been looking forward to seeing Mark again until she found herself scanning the grocery store aisles the following Wednesday. She told herself it was silly. After all, what were the chances they'd cross paths again? But as if by some serendipitous design, there he was in the bakery section, holding a baguette like he was evaluating fine art. "Bread connoisseur now," Anna quipped, the words leaving her mouth before she could second-guess them. Mark turned, grinning. "What can I say? I've graduated from milk." Bread felt like the logical next step. The light-hearted banter came so naturally that Anna forgot, for a moment, how reserved she usually was with strangers. With Mark, the guarded walls she had carefully maintained seemed to lower without effort. They ended up talking by the bread stand for nearly 20 minutes, discussing everything from their favorite childhood meals to the pros and cons of sourdough. "Do you ever try baking?" he asked. "Oh, I dabble," Anna replied with a modest shrug. "Though it's mostly for myself. I don't entertain much these days." "You should try baking bread," Mark said with an encouraging nod. "I bet you'd be great at it." Anna smiled, though the thought of sharing something as simple as bread with someone else lingered in her mind long after they parted ways. Their grocery store chats became a routine. Some weeks, it was a chance encounter in the cereal aisle. Other weeks, Mark seemed to show up precisely where Anna happened to be. They'd exchange tips on produce, laugh over the absurdity of overpriced spices, and sometimes linger by the checkout, their conversations spilling into the parking lot. Mark began to share more about himself, his love of photography, his struggle to find a decent cup of coffee in town, and stories about his younger sister, who had always been his biggest supporter. He was open, unfiltered in a way that disarmed Anna, who often found herself holding back out of habit. One afternoon, after a particularly long chat about their mutual dislike of store-bought tomato sauce, Mark surprised her. "You know," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sincere, "I look forward to running into you here. You're easy to talk to." Anna's heart stuttered for a moment. It had been years since anyone had said something so kind, so direct to her. "I enjoy our talks too," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. The moments they shared grew longer and more personal. They began meeting outside the store, walking through the nearby park, or sitting on a bench with takeaway coffee cups in hand. Mark would crack jokes, and Anna would laugh in a way she hadn't in years, freely without reserve. For the first time in a long while, her days didn't feel so predictable. The thought of seeing him, of hearing his stories and sharing her own, brought a spark of anticipation that had been missing from her life. She told herself it was just a friendship, a fleeting connection with someone who brought light into her otherwise quiet world. But every time she thought about him, his laughter, the warmth in his voice, the way he looked at her with such genuine interest, her heart skipped in a way that felt far from ordinary. It was as if he had reintroduced her to a part of herself she had long forgotten, a part that wanted to feel alive, connected, and seen. And though she didn't dare say it aloud, she began to wonder if Mark felt the same. Anna's realization didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly, like the first blush of dawn, soft and tentative but impossible to ignore. She had been folding laundry when it struck her, an image of Mark's smile, the way his eyes lit up when she made a joke, or the thoughtful way he listened to her stories. She paused mid-fold, a hand clutching a towel, as the truth settled over her like an unexpected wave. She cared for him, more than she should, more than she dared admit. The thought left her breathless. How had it come to this? He was young, so young, with a life ahead of him brimming with possibilities. What could someone like her, with her years of careful solitude and her history of half-forgotten dreams, possibly offer someone like him? And yet, she couldn't deny the warmth that unfurled in her chest whenever she thought of him. It was as though he had stepped into her life and brought with him a vibrancy she hadn't realized she was missing. The next time they met, she saw him in a different light. He was sitting on the park bench where they had started meeting on lazy Sunday afternoons, his camera resting on his lap as he waited for her. The sight of him, his face softened by the golden light of the setting sun, made her heart flutter in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "You're late," he teased, looking up as she approached. "Traffic," she lied with a grin. The truth was, she had spent an extra 15 minutes deciding on an outfit, something she hadn't done in years. They fell into their usual rhythm, trading stories and laughing over the quirks of small-town life. But Anna found herself studying him more closely. The way he gestured with his hands when he spoke, the way his laughter seemed to echo long after the sound faded. "Do I have something on my face?" Mark asked suddenly, catching her gaze. Anna felt heat rise to her cheeks. "No, I was just lost in thought." He smiled at her, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them. That evening, as Anna lay in bed, she tried to make sense of a storm of emotions swirling inside her. It wasn't just admiration or friendship anymore. It was deeper, more complex. She felt alive in a way she hadn't for decades, and it terrified her. She thought about the life she had lived, the years she had spent convincing herself that love was a chapter already written and closed. She had built her routines and quiet contentment as a fortress, one she hadn't expected to crumble. But now Mark had stepped into her world and shown her that it wasn't too late to feel, to want, to dream. Yet, with those feelings came doubts. What would he think if he knew? What would others think? The age gap, the unlikelihood of it all. She wrestled with the sheer improbability of her emotions being reciprocated. Anna pressed her hand to her chest, as if to still the rapid beat of her heart. She had spent so long suppressing this part of herself that now, faced with it, she didn't know what to do. For now, she decided, she would keep it to herself. It was safer that way, but deep down, she knew that this was no fleeting crush. It was the beginning of something that could either bring her incredible joy or shatter her heart completely. In the days that followed, Anna found herself torn between two opposing forces, exhilaration and doubt. Her feelings for Mark were undeniable now, but every time she allowed herself to imagine something more, a tidal wave of hesitation pulled her back. She sat at her kitchen table one quiet evening, staring at her untouched cup of tea. Her mind replayed their conversations, his laughter, the warmth in his voice when he said her name. It made her heart flutter, but then the doubts crept in, like shadows dimming the light. What would people say? She could already hear the whispers if they were seen together as anything more than acquaintances. What does she think she's doing, they'd say. He could be her son. The thought stung, but what cut deeper was her own uncertainty. Did she even have the right to feel this way? At her age, wasn't she supposed to accept that love and romance were behind her, reserved for the young and hopeful? But Mark made her feel something she hadn't felt in decades alive. She had spent so many years convincing herself that her quiet, solitary life was enough, that her time for passion and excitement had passed. And then he came along, challenging every belief she'd held about herself and what her life could still become. The conflict gnawed at her. She tried to distract herself with her usual routines, gardening, reading, even tackling an overdue closet cleanup, but everything reminded her of him. The tomatoes she tended to brought back their conversation about his favorite pasta dish. The book she picked up was one he had recommended. Even the neatly folded sweater she found in her closet made her think of how he'd complimented her cardigan just days ago. That Sunday, when they met in the park, Anna tried to keep her emotions in check. Mark was his usual self, warm, charming, and effortlessly kind, but she was more reserved, her responses measured and careful. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern flickering in his eyes. "I'm fine," she said too quickly, offering a tight smile. But she wasn't fine. Every moment spent with him made her heart ache with the weight of everything left unsaid. That night, as she lay in bed, she let the tears come. They were a mix of frustration, longing, and fear. She hated how vulnerable she felt, how much she cared, and how much she wanted something that felt impossible. But amid the turmoil, there was a glimmer of something else, a quiet, stubborn hope. She couldn't ignore how happy he made her, how much brighter her days had become since he walked into her life. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to. Anna stared at the ceiling, the moonlight casting faint patterns on the walls. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if? What if she let herself hope, despite the doubts? What if she stopped worrying about what others might think and listened to her own heart instead? The thought was both terrifying and liberating. She didn't have answers yet, but one thing was clear. Mark had awoken something in her that couldn't be silenced. It was a battle she wasn't ready to surrender, even if the odds seemed stacked against her. Anna closed her eyes, her mind still racing. But for the first time in days, she fell asleep with the faintest hint of a smile. Maybe tomorrow would bring clarity, or maybe it would bring another moment with Mark. Either way, she would face it one step at a time. By the following week, Anna found herself caught between hesitation and resolve. Her feelings for Mark weren't fading. Instead, they grew stronger with every conversation, every fleeting smile. Yet the more she felt, the more her doubts whispered in her ear. She sat in her living room one evening, Lucy curled up on her lap, staring at a cookbook she hadn't touched in years. Its pages were filled with recipes she used to love making when her life was fuller, when there were more people at her table. Now, it felt almost absurd to cook anything elaborate just for herself. But then she thought of Mark. "You should try baking bread," he had said. His words replayed in her mind, not just as a casual suggestion but as an invitation to rediscover something she had let slip away, a piece of herself she'd packed away along with the cookbook. She ran her fingers over the spine of the book, a small smile tugging at her lips. Maybe it was time to do something bold. The idea of inviting him over felt both thrilling and terrifying. It wasn't that she feared his response. Mark had always been warm and open, but the significance of what the invitation might mean was enough to make her heart race. She imagined him in her home, filling the quiet space with his laughter, and the thought alone made her pulse quicken. The next time they met at the park, Anna worked up the courage. They were sitting on their usual bench, sipping coffee as the autumn leaves rustled around them. "I was thinking," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest, You mentioned wanting to try homemade bread. I've been meaning to bake, and I thought maybe—" she paused, glancing at him. "Maybe you'd like to come over sometime and help me test a recipe." Mark's face lit up, his smile wide and genuine. "Are you kidding? I'd love that. It's been ages since I've had real homemade bread." His enthusiasm warmed her, but it also stirred the nerves she had been holding back. This was it, the step she hadn't dared to take with anyone in years. They settled on a day, and as the time drew closer, Anna found herself oscillating between excitement and apprehension. She spent hours preparing, cleaning every corner of her small home, rearranging furniture, and even buying fresh flowers for the table. She caught herself laughing at her own efforts. It was just Mark, after all. But it wasn't just Mark. When the day arrived, Anna stood in the kitchen, flour dusting her hands as she kneaded dough. The scent of rosemary filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee brewing in the background. She heard the knock on the door and felt her heart leap. When she opened it, Mark stood there with a bottle of wine in one hand and that familiar smile on his face. "Thought I'd bring something to pair with the bread," he said, stepping inside. Anna's home felt different with him there, warmer, livelier. As they worked together in the kitchen, laughter filled the space, and for the first time in years, Anna felt like the walls around her heart were truly beginning to crumble. She didn't know what the evening would bring, but as they kneaded dough side by side, she couldn't help but feel a quiet hope blooming in her chest. Perhaps this was the start of something new, something she had been too afraid to imagine before. The evening unfolded in a rhythm she hadn't expected, a dance of warmth, ease, and connection. As Mark set the wine bottle on the kitchen counter and they slid the freshly shaped dough into the oven, the atmosphere between them seemed to shift. It was no longer just two people sharing a meal or a casual evening. There was an intimacy that came with their shared effort, mixing ingredients, chatting over the simmering pot of soup, occasionally brushing against one another as they moved through the kitchen. Each touch, each smile, seemed to make her heart beat faster, as if the very air around them was charged with something undeniable. "You're really good at this," Mark said, grinning as he adjusted the dish towels on the counter. "I don't think I've ever had a better kitchen assistant." Anna laughed, her cheeks tinged pink. "It's been a while, but I used to be pretty decent." There was an ease in their conversation, the kind of effortless exchange that comes with familiarity, like they had known each other for years, even though it had been only a few short months. The difference now was that it wasn't just friendly banter anymore. There were moments of silence, the kind that felt comfortable rather than awkward, where their eyes met and lingered just a little too long. As the bread baked, the evening wore on with casual talk, sipping wine, and laughing at some of the stories Mark shared about his childhood. Anna found herself opening up in ways she hadn't done in years. She told him about her late husband, about how their life together had once been filled with the same warmth, laughter, and shared moments. She had loved him deeply, but in a way that was quiet, steady. And then, after his passing, Anna had closed off those parts of herself, deciding that love was something that belonged to the past, to younger days. Mark listened attentively, his gaze soft, understanding. "I can't imagine what that must have been like," he said, his voice quiet but full of empathy. "I'm glad you told me." For a brief moment, Anna felt an unfamiliar weight lift. She had never quite shared the depth of that loss with anyone, especially not someone so young. Yet here she was, feeling hurt in a way that made her heart swell. Eventually, the smell of the bread filled the room, and Anna checked the oven. It was golden brown with a crispness she hadn't quite expected. As she pulled the loaf out, Mark leaned against the counter, his smile wide as he watched her. "It looks perfect," he said, and for the first time in the evening, Anna felt herself relax into the moment, truly present. They sliced the bread, the steam rising from it as the knife cut through the crust, and she served them both warm pieces with a little butter. The conversation slowed then, both of them savoring the simple pleasure of the food, the companionship. But as Anna looked at Mark across the table, she realized that this was more than just a meal. It was a shared moment, an intimacy that felt like it had always been waiting for her to claim it. When he reached across the table to refill her glass, their fingers brushed lightly, and Anna's breath caught in her chest. His touch was soft, deliberate. There was no rush, no impatience. It was a moment that felt suspended, as if the world had paused just for them. Mark held her gaze, his expression tender, but with a hint of something more, something that mirrored the longing she had been fighting within herself. "Anna," he said softly, his voice low and careful, this feels nice, doesn't it?" She nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to say something, to explain the emotions swirling in her chest, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she simply allowed herself to be there in the moment with him. And then, before she could second-guess herself, Anna reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. The simple contact sent a current through her that was both electrifying and calming. He didn't pull away. Instead, he gently turned his hand over, threading his fingers through hers. It was a quiet, simple gesture, but in that moment, Anna felt the weight of it, of everything they had shared in the past few months, everything unspoken between them. This wasn't just bread or wine or even the laughter. It was a quiet promise, a connection that went beyond the walls they had built around themselves. For the first time in what felt like forever, Anna allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be more to this. More than she had ever dared hope for. As the evening wound down, Anna found herself standing by the window, gazing out into the soft darkness of the night. Mark had left not long ago after helping her clean the kitchen. The silence of the house was comforting, but it felt different now, less empty. His presence lingered, a gentle reminder of the warmth that had filled her home that evening. She leaned against the windowsill, her thoughts swirling. What was she doing? What had just happened between them? For a long time, she had kept her heart guarded, told herself that at 52, love was something that belonged to a younger version of herself, a version that had dreamed of romance and adventure. But in the quiet moments with Mark, that version of herself had resurfaced. She had never imagined that at this stage in her life, she would experience something so pure, so full of possibility. The way he had looked at her, the softness in his voice, the way his fingers had brushed against hers, those things had stirred something deep within her, something she had long since buried. Was it foolish to let herself feel this way? She recalled the way Mark had looked at her as she poured him another glass of wine, his gaze steady and warm, without judgment or hesitation. It was in the way he listened, the way he made her feel seen, not just for her age or her past, but for who she was now in this moment. But still, she couldn't entirely silence the nagging voice in the back of her mind. Was it appropriate? Could it work? Was she being naive, chasing a fantasy? She had spent years building a life without romantic expectations, creating a peaceful solitude that had allowed her to heal from the loss of her husband. And now, with Mark, everything felt different, risky, uncertain, but alive. The difference in their ages had always been at the forefront of her mind. At times, it seemed so glaring, so impossible. But as she stood there in the quiet of her home, she realized that age was merely a number. The connection they shared, what they spoke about, how they laughed together, the shared understanding that had slowly blossomed, was not defined by how many years lay between them. The world often told women like her that they should accept their place, that love after a certain age was a luxury reserved for the young, or for those with fewer regrets and more time. Society demanded that women embrace their roles as caregivers, as mothers, and let go of any notion of passion that belonged to the past. But sitting there, in the silence after Mark had left, Anna felt something stir in her. It wasn't just the excitement of a new possibility. It was the realization that love could look different at any stage in life. It could surprise you. It could heal wounds you thought were long past. Anna thought of her late husband, of their years together. They had shared something beautiful, but it had been steady, predictable, and loving in a quiet way. And while she would always cherish those memories, Mark offered her something else. A spark, an unexpected rush of emotion, the chance to explore a part of herself she had long neglected. This wasn't just about age. It was about connection, about recognizing that life had more to offer than she had allowed herself to believe. It was about the courage to choose happiness, to open her heart again, and to defy the rules that society set for her. In that moment, Anna knew she couldn't let fear rule her anymore. Fear of judgment, fear of making a mistake. Yes, there were risks. Yes, there would be whispers, and perhaps even doubts from those closest to her. But she had lived long enough to understand that those who truly mattered would see her for who she was, not for the years between her and Mark. She smiled to herself, feeling lighter than she had in years. Tomorrow, she would see him again. And for the first time in a long time, she looked forward to the unknown with hope, not fear. Age was no longer something that held her back. It was simply a part of the journey, one that had led her here, to this moment, where love felt just as real and just as vital as it ever had been. The days following Mark's visit felt different, as if the world had subtly shifted in its axis, aligning with a rhythm Anna hadn't known was possible. It wasn't just the anticipation of seeing him again, though that certainly added a spark to her mornings. It was the quiet confidence she felt within herself, a new understanding that had bloomed in the space between her thoughts and her heart. Love, she had always thought, was something that arrived in the past, something that had happened, something to look back on with a mixture of fondness and sorrow. But now, in the quiet mornings and soft evenings, Anna understood something crucial. Love is not bound by time, age, or expectation. It is a force that moves through you when you least expect it, catching you in a moment that redefines everything you thought you knew. She no longer felt self-conscious when she thought of Mark. The thoughts that once felt foolish or out of place, he's younger, it's too complicated, had faded into the background. What remained was the simple truth of their connection. It was real, undeniable, and full of possibility. As she sat with him at the cafe just a few days later, laughing over shared stories of awkward childhood moments, Anna felt at ease, as though their age difference had never existed. He was simply Mark, someone who brought a new joy into her life in a way she hadn't expected. And she was Anna, a woman who had lived, loved, and lost, but had never stopped yearning for that deeper connection. Mark leaned across the table, his hand resting on hers, the familiar warmth of his touch sending a rush of contentment through her. He smiled, his eyes sparkling with a quiet affection. "I'm really glad we met," he said, his voice soft but earnest. Anna looked at him, her heart full. She didn't need to say anything in return, he already knew. What they had shared, what they were building, was something that couldn't be put into words. It wasn't about the years that separated them, or the uncertainty of the future. It was about the now, the moments of laughter, the shared silences, the deep understanding between them that transcended everything else. In the end, Anna realized that love is not a destination, not a goal to reach or a box to check off in a lifetime. It is a journey, and one that can begin at any moment, no matter where you are or how old you are. She had lived through heartache, disappointment, and solitude, but she had also lived through growth, resilience, and the quiet knowledge that love, in its purest form, was never bound by anything but the heart's willingness to embrace it. As she walked out of the cafe that afternoon, her hand still resting in Mark's, Anna smiled to herself, the weight of her past lighter and the promise of the future stretching out before her. No matter what came next, she had learned to follow her heart without fear, to trust in the unpredictable beauty of life and love at every stage. And that, she realized, was enough.